Hello and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. It has been the best July ever so far. The weather is amazing because it's miserable over here, and for me, it's ideal gaming weather with the rain pitter-pattering outside. I'm hoping the rest of the summer goes like this, although I'm pretty sure not many people would agree here. Bonus is that England are doing very well in the Euros too, so that's always fun. But let's head over to somewhere actually warm this week and go on over to Egypt to look at a monster who crosses over into god territory. Yes, we are looking at Apep this week for a godly monstrosity. So who is and what is Apep? Apep was described as a huge 360 feet long golden serpent from Egyptian mythology. He had a head made of flint and blue markings running the whole way down his body. It's said that he was a hooded snake in some myths, much like the very famous Egyptian cobra that could flare their hood when attacking. His length alone was impressive, and it was said to be as long and as wide as the River Nile that runs through Egypt. He was also sometimes said to appear in the guise of a Nile crocodile instead of a snake, but it's more commonly thought that he is actively a snake god. His main goal in life was to eat the sun, ending all life on Earth, but most importantly killing his biggest rival, Ra, the falcon-headed sun god king of the Egyptian pantheon. This is because Apep was also the ancient Egyptian god of evil, darkness, disorder and chaos, so literally everything that Ra stands against. He lives in the dark of the Egyptian underworld called the Duat, empowered by the darkness and waiting for his rival to wander by so that he can consume him and gain power for himself over all beings. He also commanded an army of demons from the underworld who would prey on both the living and the dead, which he could send out to the people of Egypt to cause chaos. Speaking of powers, as you can imagine for a god, there are a few that we can talk about, but many are just the usual god traits, omniscience, omnipotent, all of those kind of things. He is immortal, but not invulnerable, with the power to regenerate any damage done to him when he slinks back into the underworld after a fight, hibernating in the dark pits, needing no nourishment to bring him back up to full health to go and fight again. He's also said to have a manipulative stare, where he can hypnotise his enemy, create earthquakes when he moves on the earth, or storms and solar eclipses, as well as bringing a general primordial darkness wherever he goes. There was a routine to Apep's attacks though. Ra would pass into the Duat each night as he walked with the setting sun, where Apep would be waiting for him. He would attempt to swallow Ra, however Ra would always win with the help of an entourage of other Egyptian gods, such as Bast, the goddess of cats, Set, the god of tempests, Sobek, the god of strength and power, Thoth, the god of knowledge, Mut, the goddess of justice, and lastly Isis, the goddess of magic. Apep's horde never stood a chance against them, and he was defeated each and every night. There was only one exception to this, where Ra would be caught off guard in broad daylight and swallowed, causing a solar eclipse. However, Apep would very quickly be disemboweled by Ra's entourage and would slink back into the shadows, ready and regenerating the next day for a new fight. Apep is also known as the Eater of Souls, as during the day when the light of the sun was not on a certain part of the earth, he would consume all of the souls within the dark, never giving them a chance to resurrect or live within the underworld. In addition to this, his bite was deadly, he could eat people whole, and could even fly, so he's a pretty scary dude. Also, a good point to mention was that he could also talk, just like all of the Egyptian gods, even though they mostly had those animal heads. So, how did Apep come to be? This one is actually very disputed amongst folklorists, which makes it super interesting. Some say that he was born from the umbilical cord of Ra, and so was born very late and following him. But this is contested, as some Egyptian creation myths cite that Ra was born from the primordial ocean by the creator god Atum, meaning that the umbilical cord never existed. However, others claim that Apep was formed by the primordial Nile goddess Neith, who created Apep while spitting at the god Nu, and her length of spit became this reflection of rivalry and spite in the form of a snake. That means, of course, there is only one of him, he also doesn't reproduce to make more of him, and he can't die, so he is very much a solo monster and god within this story. Now, the etymology for Apep is tricky because there's no official guide on how to interpret hieroglyphics, but it is believed that Apep means he who was spat out, which backs up both of these origin stories for him. He did have another name though, but in Greek it's Apophis, but we're not too sure what that means, and so I'm just going to let it lie. But it is a commonly used name for him, especially when talking from a Greek perspective about the Egyptians, because you have to remember, they were around at the same time. For history, of course, we can talk about the ancient Egyptians, but please know that we don't have a specific date for when this monster may have come to be. It may have been before the ancient Egyptians even started writing about him, so do keep that in mind. What I can tell you is that the ancient Egyptians were around between the first king being crowned in 3100 BC to the death of the last pharaoh, Cleopatra, in 30 AD. The ancient Egyptian religion was polytheistic, meaning they worshipped a pantheon of gods, which at one point totalled almost 1,500 gods. But pharaohs were considered gods themselves, and were believed to have divine powers, but as well as this acted as intermediaries between the wider pantheon. However, their main aim was to maintain Ma'at, which is the natural order of things through worship and offerings, as well as repelling chaos, which was personified in our monster Apep. Duality was really important in the ancient Egyptians' eyes, and in order for this to exist, there had to be a fight between good and evil. Apep, of course, was not worshipped in ancient Egyptian society, but actively feared and banished by the people. Instead of having temples dedicated to him, there were temples dedicated to eradicating his evil, where priests would create effigies of him and imbue it with all of the evil of the land, then would crush, beat, and cover it in mud and then burn it. They also created wax figures of Apep and would dismember them. Then they would use it to burn a drawn version of the snake on a piece of papyrus. There's actually a whole book of ways to dismiss Apep called the Book of Aphosis, because the Egyptians generally hated him this much. There were a few stories about him, but they're mostly linking to this attack on Ra and the rest of the pantheon. For instance, in one myth, Apep would trap the boat of Ra in his massive coils, which were referred to as the sandbanks, or cause the waters of the underworld to flood to overwhelm him. However, would never actually succeed in swallowing the god. There were also multiple funerary texts where it would show Apep being dismembered, releasing souls that he had destroyed, or even being sliced up by a giant cat with a giant knife, which is either thought to be Ra himself, Hathor, the goddess of the sky, or of course, Bast, the goddess of cats. According to one myth, Apep would hypnotise Ra and the rest of his entourage, except Set, who would repel the serpent by piercing his side with a spear. He was very often linked to Set, and sometimes even considered to be the same god, as Apep and Set were both gods of chaos and were linked to this same scary weather events on Earth, as well as the demon goddess Tarouet. However, Set could always be reasoned with and was often a force for good, whilst Apep was his polar opposite. Now, Apep is a part of a monster type that we've covered before with ancient Egypt. You might remember, if you've been a listener for a while, that we covered Ammit, the goddess of death and judgment upon death. This crocodile goddess devours the hearts of the evil, but this is just her job. She allows those who achieve Mart, or that balance, to go free and live life in peace in the Duat, or should I say afterlife, just damning the evil to her stomach. Apep is slightly different here, because he is inherently evil and wants to kill everyone on the planet, beginning with his arch nemesis. But before you come for me and say, Erin, I thought this podcast was meant to be minus God and heroes. Well, to that I say, it's hard. Especially with ancient Egypt. It's one of the most popular mythologies to study, however, there are not many mythical beasts attached to it, which means I can't cover it a lot, and that makes me and everyone else sad. So sometimes I do have to plunge our toes into the godly monsters that are sitting on the edge of monstrosity and godliness. But what's important here is the definition of monstrosity within mythology, and what I, on this podcast, deem as monstrous. And by that, I personally mean mythical beasts, be them good, bad, ugly, and potentially godlike. Both Ammit and Apep could be considered mythical beasts, being giant creatures and not human, and the religion is ancient enough as to not offend anyone by putting them within a monster or beast kind of bracket. So, that's my justification, but just to reiterate, Apep is literally just a giant snake with god powers who wants to eat everything. I would deem that pretty monstrous, even if he is a god. And we have monsters that are very similar, like the basilisk, that have the same kind of amount of powers, just no godliness attached to them. And so, why shouldn't he be included in a comparable? Whilst Ammit is a really, really good comparison for this one, in terms of the same mythos and godliness, another great comparison is Jormungandr from Norse mythology. Technically, the world serpent who could consume the world is a god themselves, and is just waiting for Ragnarok to consume most of the Norse pantheon, only to be defeated by Thor, god of thunder, during those end times. Jormungandr is pretty chill the rest of the time, relaxing in the bottom of the ocean, and only really coming up to munch on a ship or two to pass the time. He's also literally holding the world in balance, so the idea of Mart could also wind into this monster, making them a nice Norse version of Apep. Of course, if you want to hear more about Jormungandr, I did cover him probably about a year ago, so I'd recommend listening to that one if you fancy it.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men?
Turn your dial to find the frequency of the past.
Captain Advice.
Where the classic stories of mysteries, sci-fi, thrillers, and suspense are found waiting to be heard once again.
Another case for Nick Carter, Master Detective.
You'll find a variety of those stories here, in their original form, where each episode takes you to another place or time.
The Man of Bronze, Doc Savage.
But only when you find the mystery frequency. Available everywhere.
The shadow knows.
Now, on to modern media. Apep is not in a huge amount of media himself. However, what I can give you is some ancient Egyptian bits to fill it in. For art, have a look at some classic art pieces taken from tomb paintings of Apep. That will give you the most reliable description and image of him. Otherwise, have a look at some of the cool independent bits on this monster for a better representation of what he might have looked like. In movies though, we have Aladdin, Joseph, King of Dreams, Gods of Egypt, Weighing of the Heart, The Pyramid, Prince of Egypt, The Mummy series, Death on the Nile, Cleopatra, The Ten Commandments, Exodus, Gods and Kings, Pharaoh, Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, Stargate, and X-Men Apocalypse. I'm not saying any of these movies are good, by the way, they are just containing bits about ancient Egypt. For TV, we have Moon Knight, Cleopatra in Space, American Gods, Mummies Alive, The Fall of House Usher, Oh, Suddenly Egyptian God, Rome, The Cleopatras, Papyrus, Stargate, Yu-Gi-Oh!, The Secrets of Isis, and Tutenstein. In video games, we have ones such as The Scorpion King, Rise of the Akkadian, which does actually have Apep in, Total War Pharaoh, Age of Mythology, Civilization, Genshin Impact, Ankh, Pharaoh, Immortal Cities, Children of the Nile, Assassin's Creed Origins, Super Mario Bros, Entombed, Big Karnak, Lara Croft and the Temple of Osiris, Crash Bandicoot 3, Warped, Serious Sam, The First Encounter, Titan Quest, An Egyptian Tale, Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy, Empire Earth 2, Art of Supremacy, Smite, and Valley of the Kings. My book recommendation this week is for Ancient Egypt, Gods, Myth and Personal Practice by John Baines, or Egyptian Mythology, A Guide to the Gods, Goddesses and Traditions of Ancient Egypt by Geraldine Pitch for some really great ancient Egyptian reads. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? Well, it's an easy one and a hard one all at once, because the idea of a giant snake roaming around is pretty scary, but also pretty fantastical. So the logical brain part is screaming no at me, especially for the flying part. However, this is a god that spends most of his time in the underworld, so of course we wouldn't see him or have any need to fear him until the night time. But I've also not heard about or seen a giant snake roaming about stealing souls in the night then either. But again, they are gods. We're not meant to see them in their true form, so there is also that. As someone who believes in multiple deities myself, I think there's room for one ruling over darkness and chaos in the Egyptian pantheon, and I like this monster very much to oversee that. Because they're gods too, it kind of reiterates that questioning their existence, and it's a bit tricky in terms of territory for me. I don't want to dismiss the belief of an entire religion and civilization, and also their creation story to that religion, who believed in them, I guess. So I suppose this one is a definite maybe for me. I do love that he's so hell-bent on destroying his arch nemesis that he will just go back and back again to try and get a little jump on him when there's an eclipse. And I just think that's pretty wholesome in a kind of way. Either way, Apep is pretty metal, and he's the god that scares me, but I also think is pretty cool and interesting. So there's that. But what do you think? Does Apep still rule over evil and darkness in Egypt? Let me know on Twitter, I would love to know what you think about this one. Now, I love covering monsters that cross into that god category. It makes them so much more interesting to research and gets us right in there with the religion of these ancient civilizations and generally how they saw the world. So they end up being some of my favourite ones to cover just for wider information around the mythos they came from. Especially with this one going into that creation myth, but also the idea of the never-ending battle between good and evil, but also between night and day. I think that's so fun. Next week though, we're heading over to China for a zombie of another name. And it's our actual first ever zombie episode too, which I'm so excited for. So come shuffling and moaning in with the Jiangxi next Thursday. For now, thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. And I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Threads and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, including some very cool merchandise. You can also find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals, they might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you later, babes.